Welcome to Breaking Indecision. Sometimes, our decision to plan the next best move doesn't always go as planned. What do we do in a world of chaos and overload of information? Do we do the right thing and still end up in the wrong place? From around the world, the Trilateral Strategic Studies Group is broadcasting a deeper dive into those questions that bring the how to the foresight on strategic decision making. Welcome back. Do we have an exciting episode for you today? I am Master Sergeant Philip Berry from Headquarters Air Force, A4 Logistics and Maintenance Director, Tesseract. And I will be your host on today's episode of Breaking Indecision. Our esteemed discussion hosts.
I'm Wing Commander Yves Gagnon. I'm the Royal Air Force Liaison Officer for the French Air and Space Force headquarters here in Paris. And as a member of the Trilateral Strategic Steering Group, it's just a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to discuss decision-making in the post-information age with General Mattis.
I'm Colonel Christophe Pubeni. I'm the French exchange officer working here at the Pentagon for almost 2 years and a half. My background, I'm an air mobility pilot. I started my career in 1998, C-160. And after I switched to OT&E, flying the Atlas.
Yves and Christophe will be interviewing a man that has lived through some of the toughest decisions. I'm excited and honored to be hosting for our former Secretary of Defense, General Jim Mattis.
Yeah, I'm Jim Mattis. Spent 4 decades in the Marine Corps as an infantry officer, doing all the things you expect of infantry officers. And I rose to be the one of the NATO Supreme Allied Commanders, commander of U.S. Central Command. Eventually spent 2 years as the Secretary of Defense, and honored to be here with Colonel Christophe and Wing Commander Yves, representing two of our strongest, absolutely longest, most enduring allies to whom we owe a great deal.
Regarding your tremendous career, so you have been able to command at every level, from a platoon leader to a brigade to a division and to the higher level that we can expect in the DoD. So I was wondering how the decision making is different at each level and how it has changed throughout your career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Colonel Christophe, thank you. And it's a pleasure to go straight into the very essence of leadership in the military. As a young officer, I wanted to be a player coach, which meant you know how to play the game, but you would do most of your time coaching. And I realized after a year or so as a platoon leader in the infantry with your young sailors and Marines, I could command them in about 10 minutes a day. But to make a decision, we're going to the field, here's what we're going to practice, here's what we're going to do, going out to sea, deploying, that sort of thing, 10 minutes a day. The rest of the time I spent coaching. And 40 years later, as a 4-star general commanding forces from dozens of nations, 250,000 US and allied forces, I could command the 250,000 in about 10 minutes a day. The rest of the time now I was coaching admirals and generals from a host of countries. But we're all the subject in terms of your question of our formative experiences. And of course, those first years in the military bring a life-changing event into full focus for you. And for me, it was the Marine Corps. It had to do with the naval service and its form of command and control, which we call command and feedback. We don't want tight control of our forces. We specifically believe that enables the enemy to dance around you. And that focus was on the enemy. I often knew when I was in hard fighting, I knew more about the enemy's dispositions than my own. I had sergeants and lieutenants under me who knew what to do, captains, eventually majors, and even generals. They knew what to do. I focused on the enemy. And that changes your worldview when you do that. You're no longer looking internally to yourself. You've either mastered your trade or you haven't at the point of contact, at the time of contact. On friendly forces, what I wanted to do with my decision making and my approach to it was to unleash two qualities: initiative and aggressiveness of subordinates. And everything I did had to be within that framework. If I was going to constrain their initiative for any reason, there had to be a doggone good reason for it, because what I was in effect doing was ceding some of the opportunities to the enemy at that point. And so, from the tactical to the strategic level, the commander's role is to define reality, and then their intent comes out in purpose, method, and end state. And if I was to talk about it like Mozart, I would have the first bar of music would be very clear, a few very clear notes. Sending 23,000 sailors and Marines of 1st Marine Division into Iraq, I said, my aim is to shatter the 51st Mech Division if they fight. The end state, the last bar in the score of music, would be a few very clear notes. At the end of this phase, we will be positioned to do the following. In the method part, that's the purpose, and there's the end state. In the method part in the middle, Colonel Christoph, I would only use probably 1/3 as many notes as Mozart. Again, what you leave out and what it allows for, let me change the musical direction here. It allows for a jazz man in New Orleans to do his improvisation and use his God-given brain and hopefully the training and coaching I've given him as a subordinate commander, delegating as many decisions as possible to the lowest competent level. So you start with problem setting, and here it is critical setting the mission in its unique circumstances. And the reason I'm going on at length in answer to your question, Colonel Christoph, is this is the very essence of leadership. And by setting the problem in its unique circumstances, I think tactical decision making is often more quantitative than non-quant, than subjective, because you can quantify so many known things at the tactical edge, the leading edge. The higher up you go, it shifts, not always, but it can become actually more the art of war than science of war at the strategic level. But underpinning any process in around you as a commander, especially as you get up to the colonel, the colonel, the wing commander, the brigadier, and higher major general level, it is critical you keep your mavericks around you. These are the guys who forgot to get a haircut and their shoes aren't always shined, and they always ask damn vexing questions and they irritate people. And you've got to keep them around because you don't want the enemy to teach you what the maverick was trying to throw in your path. And here I would also say you keep challengers close. As I understand it from Master Sergeant Barry, we're on a breaking indecision podcast, and you've got to recognize that the ability and the willingness to take decisions matters a great deal. I have seen people who are wonderfully schooled, and then at the point of decision, they simply can't move. They can't take the decision. I've seen it for a number of reasons, some very, very noble reasons, noble, good men who could not do it. And then I've seen others who they had not prepared themselves as young officers for the day when they got tapped on the shoulder. And the result was in their stomach, they knew they weren't ready. And if leadership needs one thing, it's self confidence, built on competence, but self confidence. And I think that the temperament of the individual commander is absolutely crucial. And here I prefer always to quote smart people under no illusions about my own intellect at all. But Barbara Tushman in Guns of August talks about how some are made bold by the moment, some irresolute, some are carefully judicious, and some become paralyzed and powerless to act. So I think if as a commander you can also use history to help you ask the right questions, you're more apt to make decisions at the speed of relevance, the speed of war. So I hope that throughout my career you see the themes that started young carried me through, became more refined, but the differences at each level are less important if you have a rigorous quantitative, non-quantitative process. If you go with no quantitativeness, you're simply lazy. If you stay quantitative too long, you're brittle and mechanical, and you don't apply non-quant your military judgment right. So knowing when you shift from quant to non-quant and doing it at the speed of war is critical. Back over to you, Christoph.
Oh, thank you, sir. That was absolutely great, especially when you address the balance between science and art in a decision. And the higher you get, the less science it is, and more art, which is basically based on your background and your experience. So I will refer to Eve for the next question.
So there's so many places we can go with this. I mean, that was fantastic, and thank you. And I echo what Christoph says about the quant and the qual. And you may be aware that we've got a few of these podcasts with people such as you. We deem super subject matter experts to help us along the way of getting the debate talking about our topic. And I've interviewed a retired chief of joint operations for the French military, General Grégoire de Saint-Quentin. Lots of things echoed in what you've said. In fact, he said, if you can't trust your subordinates, don't go to war. I think that echoes what some of what you've said. He also talks about training, which feeds in nicely to a French psychologist, a cognitive psychologist, who talked to us about cognitive, um, talking about choice paralysis, in fact, in decision making. And when you're overloaded with information, you can become paralyzed. And he says that what humans then generally do is they revert back to a default mode. And a default mode is very much what you've been trained, what you've learned throughout your career, the ethos you were given. So that's just fantastic what you've shared with us. And I'm sure many of our viewers will have read Call Sign Chaos. I read it one sitting, not because I read quickly, but because I can sit for a long time. But I'm sure that a lot of people recognize some of the points here. I was wondering, because the topic this year is about the post-information age, which is something that's not really well defined. And I was wondering, in everything you've said, how you can take that forward into the leaders of tomorrow who are saturated with information, both in the highest corridors of power, politically and militarily, right down to the airman, the soldier, the aviator, the soldier, and the sailor on the ground, who are, and I quote another one of our experts, who are digital natives. So a lot of the information today, I think, is all the way across the chain of command, where perhaps a certain number of years ago wouldn't have been the case. And I wonder if you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I sure can, because we've seen some critical events happen that resulted in catastrophe, both in history, but even during our career time, when information was available, not acted upon. The overabundance of information is a choice, because you can organize yourself. A leader is there, they're not carried along in Marxian terms just to be carried along like a leaf in a stream going downhill. Leaders make a difference. And I would just suggest here that you have to ensure that your staff and subordinate commanders know how you make decisions, because that allows them to start thinking about, the three questions that at every level of command and staff, uh, where you want a ruthless search for the critical information by everyone. So I always thought in every unit I was in, somewhere in that unit was all the information I needed to make a pretty good decision. Was I opening the lines of communication? Did they know my priorities? Were we displaying the information? Because information not displayed, even verbally displayed, but certain times graphically displayed, it's not acted upon. And so I told everyone when I took command, I'd always get the staff together with the commanders sitting around listening as I told the staff what I wanted them to do. And I said, there's three types of information in my construct. And one is housekeeping, just those things you do have to file away as you have a shock absorber inside you as a commander. So when surprises hit, you know where to reach for your reserves. You know which units are rested, which units are refueled. Unit morale. If you know a unit's taken heavy casualties and needs a little time for the NCOs and the junior officer to calm the troops, all that stuff is housekeeping. Then you've got decision making information. And this is, are the conditions right to shift the main effort from this unit to another, to hold up the ground force and put the air in at max levels? If they know you're looking for that, if they know that you're looking for the information that would say, okay, we're shifting to another phase in the operation, then that decision making information has got to come through as a priority. And the last, of course, is alarms. In the naval service, we call it night orders. Wake the commander, wake them. The INW officer, the indication and warnings intelligence officer, should always have unimpeded, immediate access, wake you up in the middle of the night and know what are those key essential elements of information. You've got to have people who are searching for the information because they know what you need to do your job. And by doing that, you also set essential elements of information for them that allows them to be better sentinels for their own units. Um, you have to reward curiosity. Institutions get the behavior they reward. And I wanted at every telephone and radio, scotch taped at times on a little card on a radio, were three questions. What do I know? Who needs to know? Have I told them? And telling them isn't sending a message. It's, did they acknowledge that you sent that information to them? I would tell you that if you can better define risk and what you consider risk to be, you'll not have people jumping up and down with what is really just the normal heave and hoe of a battlefield with opportunities and crises opening and closing. So I said, from now on, here's the way we define risk. And this will really cut back on the overload of information. What specific element takes what specific risk for what specific period of time? And by quantifying, remember, going back to the earlier discussion with Colonel Christoph, once you define reality and once you have it laid out quantitatively, at that point you apply your military judgment. And all of a sudden, people's alignment on what level of risk was really there became much more sophisticated. I think too, um, you've got to balance decisions when you're talking about this abundance of information coming in between your instinct to go quickly and the timeliness of the decision if you pause and get a little more information. And so it's a matter of study, mostly of study, because if you've read enough, what will happen is you will pick up something similar, and that allows you to ask the right questions. And pretty soon you're leaving aside a lot of the extraneous information that's coming. Some people are trying to come cascading in. Back over to you. Uh, we'll see how I'm doing there. You know, I am always worried when I'm in front of a wing commander. You know, they can count above 10 without taking their boots off. So go ahead, Eves.
But that's two of us, sir, because I'm always worried when I speak to a four-star general, to a former Secretary of Defense. But I'm sure we'll muddle through it together. But I guess pass it on to Christophe.
What is the fundamental difference, according to you, between making a national decision and a decision implying allies and partners? Do you think there are still things that preclude the US or other nations to take a quick decision involving allies and partners? Because you present the decision at the tactical level where there is the sense of urgency. We know that there are troops under contact. We know that lives are at stake. But regarding all your career, do you think it's easier to do a national decision, or is it different to do a decision involving allies and partners who may have different caveats or even different culture.
Yeah, yeah. Again, goes to the heart of coalition alliance warfighting. Very, very good question. I would tell you that for the U.S. Marines, because we cannot solve problems generally using mass in general, because we're on ships, we often find it easier to deal with decision making by foreign militaries that also do not have the mass. Uh, and not that you can't mass at a specific point of contact, but that generally speaking, you're going to have to use cunning, an artistic interpretation sometimes of your order of battle, and opportunistic kind of decision making to make up for what we don't bring. For example, like the U.S. Army or the U.S. Air Force can come in, and when they come, it's going to be big and it's going to be ugly for the enemy. But we have to make it ugly on a different level. And I did not find much difference because of that, working with generally under Army commanders, Air Force commanders. I was able to make my points and gain support for what I want to do generally, not always. There were sometimes wider issues, but certainly I did not find it any more difficult to deal with an international coalition, of however it's defined. I will say that NATO, of course, is first among equals, where we have STANAG, standardization agreements. We have so many years of working together. The trust is very deep. There is that altruism of history that nations with allies thrive, nations without allies wither. And so any country that thinks they can do it on their own, that wants to say, my country first, or strategic autonomy for Europe, this is all crazy. We're stronger together, as NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg put it in one of the simplest and most persuasive statements possible. The greatest generation of Americans learned the hard way about pulling back and not wanting to be with your allies and watching fellow democracies take the brunt of an enemy take them down.
Thank you, sir. That was great, and I do hope that you could still be in the Pentagon to kick some ass, because as an exchange officer, I'm struggling every day to be fully integrated in your bureaucracy.
So, General Mattis, in regard to informative decision making, when it comes to policies and regulations and the bureaucracy that may oppose the information on hand, what advice would you offer senior enlisted or younger officers as they attempt to pivot on a dime to make an informed decision?
Yeah, I think, Master and Barry, the way I would approach it is each service has its own culture. And that culture has probably grown up for a reason, dealing with the specific environment in which you're fighting, whether it be air, maritime, land, or hopefully a mix of those. And I think what you need to do is make certain you avail yourself of the various forums in order to point out specific problems. And remember what Einstein said: get agreement on what the problem is. Now, you can do that when you're talking in theory or in general or about the culture. And you can get people to understand why certain people need to be trained to make those decisions at lower levels and then enabled to do so. It does no good to train them and then say, by the way, all the decisions come to the general, something like that. But if it's at the point of contact, if it's in the midst of something, you're in a crisis when you start waiving the rules, okay? That's a sure sign you're in a crisis. And what you want to do at that point is notify your boss what you're doing, take the action, and as he's getting patted on the back for the great job by his subordinate, he'll learn a lesson about delegating down to the NCOs and the junior officers. Okay, so don't worry about it as long as what you're doing is ethically sound and is operationally taking advantage of the situation. And ask your commander before you deploy and all, what is your intent? What do you want done here? So that you have the framework within which you could take that action and be consistent with where he wants to take the unit. But I would say that institutions get the behavior they reward. And we hope that the Air Force is rewarding, initiative and aggressiveness. And certainly from what we've seen out of General C.Q. Brown, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, that's exactly what he wants. So if some of the people in the middle, the bureaucracy, aren't quite getting the word, use your Airman magazine, use Air Power magazine, use all those things. Um, don't hesitate to do it. You'd be surprised how many seniors want to hear from NCOs. And seniors right now, I would put at the lieutenant colonel and colonel level, and they can make changes. They can make changes, but they need to have confidence that they and you agree on the same problem. And that's why you have to do the 55 minutes defining the problem and then coming up with the solution.